much, at least, of natural theology belongs to the metaphysically certain sort. Compare section 44 of the preliminary discourse. That includes the principles of divine justice and what follows from them, such as that God will not damn the innocent and that the necessary grace will not be denied to one who does what is in his power. I believe Leibniz also thought it absolutely certain, and a part of the true natural theology, that God will not damn anyone who has a pure love of God above all things. But what depends on history and the facts, or on the interpretation of texts, as revealed theology does, belongs to the sort of theology that cannot have more than moral certainty. In the letter to Burnet, Leibniz also divides philosophy into two parts. Theoretical philosophy is founded on true analysis, of which the mathematicians give examples. But practical philosophy is founded on the art of estimating the degrees of proofs, or as we would say, of probabilities. Thus, Leibniz assigns merely probable reasoning as such to the practical part of philosophy. Why does Leibniz do that? For the same reason, I think, that the highest degree of probability is called moral certainty. That means a strong enough probability of truth to act on. Indeed, I suppose we should add, strong enough to act on decisively in matters of the greatest importance. The practical character of probable reasoning is underlined when Leibniz tells Burnet that only the jurists, whose reasoning, of course, is required to be practical, have given examples that can serve as a beginning for forming a science of proofs, suitable for verifying historical facts and for giving the meaning of texts. Hence, Leibniz goes on to say that a well-established discipline of theology requires a moral dialectic and a natural jurisprudence. Although Leibniz classified the science of proofs or probabilities as part of practical philosophy, it is clear that he thought that the degrees of probability can be determined theoretically, and that a high degree of theoretical probability is required for rational acceptance of a merely probable proposition. The most plausible interpretation of his view, I believe, is that for any degree of probability less than metaphysical certainty, practical reason, and not just theoretical reason, is required to justify the conclusion, therefore I or we should accept this proposition. That is because how much probability is required to justify acceptance depends on what is at stake. In terms native to our discourse of probability, not Leibniz's, where the probability of a proposition is less than 1.0, acceptance of the probability of the acceptance of the proposition must be justified by expected utilities and not by theoretical probabilities of truth alone. On this reading, Leibniz did recognize purely theoretical beliefs about probabilities of propositions, but did not also recognize purely theoretical beliefs that have as objects merely probable propositions themselves rather than their probabilities. Instead, he recognized beliefs that consist in commitment to act on an assumption of truth based on a judgment that the presumed proposition is prudent or safe to act on, or in his role as jurist, that it is just to act on it. To what extent that was only an epistemological view that Leibniz accepted, and to what extent he actually lived his mental life in that way, is something about which I have no moral certainty. But there are many places in his theological writings, including the Theodicy, where the reasons that he seems to give as his decisive basis for adopting some merely probable view are that it is the safest one to hold, or that rejected alternatives are harmful. Discussion of the question whether theology is a theoretical or a practical science goes back at least to the 13th century. St. Thomas Aquinas argued that theology is primarily a theoretical science, but St. Bonaventure argued that it is primarily a practical science on the ground that its principal end is that we should become good, and particularly that we should be moved to love God. Leibniz is not an innovator in assigning revealed theology to the province of practical reason, though the extent of his epistemological pragmatism in theology may be surprising. What are the ends of revealed theology that shape the expected utilities in Leibniz's thinking about it? I'm sure that Leibniz would agree with Bonaventure in giving a preeminent place to the goal of fostering love for God. Indeed, Leibniz does in a number of places in the Theodicy argue against views on the ground that they do not allow an adequate basis for loving God. But another end that theology is supposed to serve also looms large in the Theodicy. We meet it early in the preface, where he narrates a brief history of religions, or at any rate, a history of the religions of Europe and the Mediterranean world. It can fairly be called a narrative of enlightenment, or of the education of the human race, as Lessing would later put it in the title of a celebrated essay. And maybe I'll digress for just a minute here on a point that was discussed earlier today, having to do, more than one occasion, with the question of how Christian Leibniz is, or whether he affirms central Christian doctrines. It seems to me that's a very tricky question. Christian and Christianity are not theological terms in the New Testament, and I think, really the only objective sort of way to answer that question is just say, in a very broad sense, Christians are people who try in a religious way to follow Jesus. And that's been a very diverse phenomenon, and different Christians and groups of Christians have their own conceptions about what's central in Christianity. And this comes back to the point of this passage in the preface of the Theodicy. It seems, and I believe it's the case, that in Leibniz's view, the central role of Jesus Christ is as educator. That's not an eccentric or unusual view. In fact, I think of all the ways of conceiving the role of Christ in salvation, that is the one that fewest Christian theologians who've written about it have omitted to include. Some include others in which Leibniz was not as interested, and others are perhaps more famous, but it isn't exactly a fringe conception here. Okay, so Leibniz's history of religions here is the history of the development of natural religion, and particularly of its attainment of public authority in and through what would later be called the positive religions. Nothing is more emphasized in this narrative than the achievement of the revealed religions of ancient Israel and Christianity in making natural religion pass into law, as Leibniz puts it, quote 20. That, Leibniz says, is what ancient philosophers among the Gentiles could not accomplish, though they already possessed, as he implies, truths of natural religion. But with the triumph of Christianity in the Roman Empire, the religion of the wise became the religion of the peoples. So, making natural religion pass into law. The connection of Christian revelation with law is a fixed point in Leibniz's theological thinking. In the mid-1680s, in his largest work in systematic theology, he wrote that God as legislator declares his particular and public will regarding the acts of minds and the governance of his city, and fixes rewards and punishments, and for that purpose instituted revelations. And in a private document of 1693, he wrote, "Theology is a sort of divine jurisprudence explicating the legal principles of our association with God." Why this connection between revelation and law? Why does Leibniz, an adherent of what we call the Lutheran Church, think religion should become law? There certainly are theistic religious traditions in which law is absolutely central, but Lutheran Christianity was not originally one of them. The answer to this question, most clearly indicated by Leibniz, is that the making known of rewards and punishments set by God is necessary if the religion of the